The stage was 3 hours late, and Everett Calloway told himself he did not mind. He stood outside the small station at Copper Creek with his back pressed against a weathered post, his eyes fixed on the empty road that cut through the Montana Valley like an old scar. October wind pushed against his coat and carried the sharp, clean promise of winter. The kind of cold that did not ask permission, the kind that simply arrived and stayed. He had lived on his mountain for 13 years. He had survived storms that pulled roofs from barns and cold, that cracked fence posts clean through. A woman stepping off a stagecoach would not change anything. That was what he told himself. That was what he had been telling himself for the better part of 3 weeks, ever since he had posted the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette and received in return a single letter written in handwriting so precise it looked almost typeset. Inside the station, men laughed over cards and tobacco smoke. Everett did not join them. He stayed outside with the wind, where the air was honest and nothing was required of him. In his coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, was that letter. He did not take it out. He did not need to. He had read it often enough that the words had settled somewhere behind his sternum, quiet and uninvited. I am not looking for romance, Mr. Calloway. I am looking for purpose. I believe we understand each other. He had not written back to say that he did not, in fact, understand her at all. A cloud of pale dust rose on the far end of the road. Then the groan of wheels. Then the dark shape of the coach against a sky the color of pewter. Everett straightened against the post, but did not move forward. To his left, near the station door, Mabel Pruitt stood with her arms folded across her chest the way she always did when she had already decided something. Her husband ran the general store on Front Street. Mabel ran everything else. She had lived in Copper Creek for 20 years and considered that tenure sufficient authority to judge most things and most people on sight. She did not lower her voice when she spoke to the man beside her. "Cincinnati woman," she said. "City bred. I give her until the first hard snow before she's begging for a ticket back east." Her husband made a sound that was neither agreement nor argument. Everett heard every word. He did not turn around, but his hand inside his coat pocket closed slowly around the folded letter. He was not sure what he was feeling. He told himself it was nothing. He had been telling himself a great many things lately that he only half believed. The coach stopped. The door swung open. A woman stepped down. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was slender, dressed in a gray wool traveling coat that had been good quality once and was still respectable, though the hem showed the road. Her hat was plain. Her hair was the color of autumn, dark brown with threads of copper at the temples, pinned back without fuss. She moved carefully, stepping down from the coach, not because she was fragile, but because she was deliberate. Every movement seemed considered. Nothing wasted. She carried a single bag. One. Everett had sent word that she could bring whatever she needed. Whatever she needed, apparently, fit in one battered leather valise that she carried herself without waiting for the driver to hand it down. Her eyes found him immediately across the small crowd of onlookers. They were gray, her eyes, clear and still. The eyes of someone who had learned long ago not to show the whole of what she was thinking. She did not smile, neither did he. He crossed the distance between them and reached for the bag without speaking. His hand closed around the handle. He registered its weight at once. It was lighter than a child's school satchel, lighter than a season's worth of anything, lighter than a life ought to be. She released it without protest. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Voss." "Mrs.," she corrected quietly. Not with sharpness, just precision. He nodded once. "Mrs. Voss." That was the whole of their introduction. Behind them, Mabel Pruitt said nothing, but Everett felt her watching the way you feel weather before it arrives. They rode out of Copper Creek within the hour. Everett had brought one horse, a steady gray quarter horse named Briar, because the trail up to Calloway Ridge was not wide enough for a wagon in October when the mud started. He swung up first, then offered his hand down to her. She took it without hesitation and settled behind him with the careful distance of someone who had thought about exactly how much space was appropriate and had measured it precisely. She did not hold on to him. She balanced herself. He noticed. The trail climbed for nearly 2 hours. The valley fell away behind them. Pine trees rose on both sides, tall and black against the pale sky, and the smell of cold resin wrapped around them like something old and permanent. Wren did not speak. Everett did not speak. The silence between them was not comfortable yet, but it was not hostile. It was simply the silence of two people who did not yet know what they were to each other. He found himself once listening to the sound of her breathing behind him. Steady, even, not frightened. He did not know what to make of that. Calloway Ridge came into view as the last light dropped behind the western peaks. The cabin stood on a flat shelf of land carved out of the mountain side, backed by a stand of lodgepole pine facing south over a long sweep of valley below. Everett had built it himself, log by log, in the winter after Miriam died, because he had needed something to do with his hands and his grief in the endless Montana dark. It had taken him 4 months. He had not rushed it. He had built it to last. It lasted. But standing beside it now, seeing it the way a stranger would see it for the first time, he noticed things he had long since stopped noticing. No curtains in the window, no garden against the south wall where a garden could have grown, no wreath on the door, no painted shutter, nothing that said someone lived here who cared about the living of it. Just logs and mortar and a chimney stained black from 13 winters. He dismounted and tied Briar to the post near the door. He lifted Wren's valise from the saddlebag where he had strapped it. He did not look back to see if she followed. She followed. Inside, the cabin was clean. He had made sure of that. Everything in its place, everything necessary, nothing soft. A cast iron stove in the corner, 2 chairs at the pine table, shelves along the east wall holding tins and jars arranged with the careful precision of a man who had made order into a kind of faith. A loft above, reached by a wooden ladder, and through the narrow door on the north wall, a small room with a rope bed and a washstand and a bar across the inside of the door. He had put the bar there himself, 3 days ago, when he had finally accepted that she was coming. "Your room is through there," he said, pointing. "I sleep in the loft. You handle the cooking and the house. I handle everything outside." He paused. That was what the advertisement said. "I remember what the advertisement said," she replied, not sharply, simply. He crouched by the stove and fed kindling into its cold mouth. The fire caught slowly, the way fires did at altitude in October, reluctantly, as if the cold had soaked too deep into the iron to give up easily. Light began to move up the log walls in long, amber shapes. He heard her set the valise down. He heard the quiet sound of the latches being released. He did not turn around. Then he heard something else. A soft rustling. the whisper of cloth being smoothed against a surface. He stood and turned without meaning to. She had taken something from the valise and spread it across the rough pine table. A piece of white linen, small enough to fold into a coat pocket, embroidered along the edges with small yellow daisies. The stitching was fine and even, worked with care by hands that had known exactly what they were doing. The linen itself was worn thin from years of washing, the color of it gone from white to the warm cream of old paper. It was the kind of thing a woman brought when she had very little to bring and chose with great care what little she kept. Everett looked at it. Something moved in the line of his jaw, a tightening and then an easing, the way a man's face moves when something catches him off guard, and he controls it before it can be read. He said nothing. He turned back to the stove. Supper was beans and hard bread. They sat across from each other with the embroidered cloth between them on the table. The fire had warmed the room enough to make the cold outside feel distant. They ate in silence. Not an empty silence, a careful one. When he finished, Everett rinsed his plate in the bucket and climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. Wren sat alone by the stove. She waited until the sound of his movement above her stilled. Then she took from her coat pocket a small notebook, its cover dark with use, and a stub of pencil. She opened it to a clean page and began to write. Not a letter, not a diary entry. Figures, numbers arranged in careful columns, checked and rechecked with the mechanical ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Everett lay in the loft in the dark. He could hear the faint scratch of her pencil through the floor below him. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the handwriting in the letter. That same precision. He thought about the single valise, the embroidered cloth. He thought about her eyes. He told himself he was not thinking about any of these things, rolled onto his side, and listened to the wind until sleep came. In the morning, Everett came down the ladder before the light had fully arrived. The cabin was already warm. The smell of coffee reached him before his boots touched the floor. She was already up, already dressed. The fire was burning high and even, not the grudging flame of a person unfamiliar with the stove, but the steady, confident burn of someone who had read the stove the way experienced people read things, quickly and correctly. She handed him a cup without turning fully around. He drank it standing by the window and looked out at the snow that had come quietly in the night and covered the ground to the tree line. "You were up before dawn," he said. "I usually am." He looked down at the cup. The coffee was strong, correctly strong. He set the cup down and went outside to see to the horse without saying anything further. He did not thank her, but he came back inside for a second cup before he went to check the fence line, and she had already filled it and left it on the edge of the stove where it would stay hot. He took it without comment. That was the first morning. That night, after supper, when the fire had burned low and the cabin had settled into its evening quiet, Wren sat at the table with her notebook again. Everett sat across from her, sharpening a knife. He was not watching her. He was simply in the same room, doing what he would have done alone. But the room was different with her in it. He could not have explained how. Nothing had changed. The walls were the same. The fire was the same. The sound of the wind was the same. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence, the way a room shifts when a window is opened and the air comes through, and you cannot go back to not knowing what outside smelled like. He kept his eyes on the knife and did not think about that either. Near the south wall, low to the floor at the base of the ladder, there was a wooden box, Plain pine, dark with age and handling. Everett had made it himself in the second year after Miriam died. He had needed something to put her things in when he could no longer stand to look at them on the shelf. The box was where it had always been. He had stopped seeing it years ago. He did not notice when Wren's eyes moved to it in the firelight and stayed there for a moment before moving carefully away. Outside, 1 mile down the trail toward town, a man sat on a horse in the pine shadows. He was not from Copper Creek. His coat was too fine for this mountain, and his horse too well kept for a man who had ridden a long way on an honest errand. He sat very still, looking up at the amber square of the cabin window against the dark of the mountainside. He looked for a long time. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the mountain toward the valley below, where the lights of Copper Creek were small and cold in the October dark. He had seen what he came to see, and he would be back. The second morning was the same as the first, and the third was the same as the second, and by the end of the first week, Everett had stopped noticing that anything had changed at all. That was the first sign that something had. Wren rose before light every morning without exception. The fire was always burning when he came down the ladder. The coffee was always strong and always hot, and always waiting at the precise edge of the stove where a cup would stay warm the longest without scorching. He had not told her where that spot was. She had found it herself on the second day, and had used it every day since. He noticed. He said nothing. She learned his habits the way water learns the shape of land, not by being told, but by moving slowly and paying attention until the shape was known. She learned that he checked the door latch twice before climbing to the loft, not because he was afraid of anything outside, but because he was a man who believed that what could be secured should be secured. She learned that he hung his coat on the left peg and never the right, and that the right peg was for something she could not yet name. She learned that he never began eating until she sat down, even when she was late coming in from the woodshed, and his plate had already gone cool. He never said a word about any of it. He simply waited, plate full, hands on the table, eyes on the middle distance, waiting without performance or complaint until she pulled out her chair and sat. She noticed. She said nothing. On the 9th day, she moved the woodpile. It had been stacked against the east wall of the cabin in the way it had always been stacked, which is to say, haphazardly, heavy logs piled on top of lighter ones with no thought given to reach or efficiency. Everett had built the stack alone and maintained it alone, and had never considered that it was anything other than adequate. Wren spent an afternoon rearranging it while he was out checking the fence line on the north pasture. She moved the heaviest logs to the bottom and the middleweight ones to chest height, where they could be lifted without strain. She stacked the kindling near the door so it could be grabbed in the dark without searching. She placed the split pine, which burned longest, at the outer edge, and the quick birch, which caught fastest, closest to the door. When Everett came back in the early evening and saw it, he stopped. "You moved the wood," he said. "It was inefficient." "It was fine." "It was fine for one person," she said from inside the cabin. "Now it is better for two." He stood in the cold outside the door and looked at the woodpile for another moment. Then he came inside without further argument. 3 days later, the wobble in her chair disappeared. Wren ran her hand along the underside of the seat and found fresh cut wood fitted clean and tight beneath the leg, shaped to compensate for the uneven floor. The work was precise, quiet, done without announcement. She sat in the chair and tested it. Solid. "The chair is fixed," she said that evening. It was crooked. It was fine. He looked up from his plate. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, brief and controlled, the ghost of an expression he did not quite allow. He looked back down at his food. "Now it is better," he said, exactly as she had said it. The same words, the same inflection, offered back to her like something borrowed and carefully returned. She looked at him across the embroidered cloth. He did not look up again, but the ghost of that expression remained a moment longer before it went. The cold deepened through October. The high peaks to the north lost their color first, going from gray to white between one morning and the next. The valley below the ridge held its brown and russet a little longer, the last warmth wrung out of the land before it surrendered. Wren watched the changing from the south window each morning while the coffee brewed, her hands wrapped around a cup, her breath misting faintly in the brief cold before the stove warmed the room. She was learning the mountain. She was learning what it required. December crept in slowly that year, the way cold crept into a cabin through the gaps around a door, gradually and without announcement, until you looked up one day and realized the whole room had changed temperature, and you had not noticed exactly when. The nights lengthened. The ridgeline disappeared behind a permanent gray overcast that pressed low and heavy against the mountain. Wren learned the sound of weather approaching by the way the horses moved in the barn, the particular restlessness that came in the hour before a storm, and she learned to check the sky to the northwest before starting any task that would take her away from the cabin for more than an hour. She learned other things too. She learned that Everett woke twice in the night, not from nightmares but from what she could only describe as vigilance, a man who had been alone long enough that sleep itself had become a kind of watchfulness. She knew this because on cold nights, the sound of his movements above her in the loft reached her through the silence. 2 careful steps to the window, a pause, 2 careful steps back. She never acknowledged it, and he never mentioned it, and she understood, without needing to be told, that this was another thing that did not require words. She learned that he had not bought new supplies of any domestic kind in at least 3 years. The soap was nearly gone. The candles were the stub ends of candles that had been burned to their limits. The good wool blanket was the one she had brought with her, which she had placed on the bed in her room without asking, and the one on his cot in the loft was thin enough to see through when held to light. She began keeping a second list in her notebook alongside the financial columns, things that were needed, not wanted, needed. She would deal with them when the opportunity arose. There was a line of letters carved low on the south-facing window frame, half hidden by the shadow of the sill. She found them on the 11th day, running her cloth along the wood during the morning cleaning. She stopped. She leaned closer. M.C. March, 1869. She read it twice. Then she straightened and finished cleaning the sill and moved on to the next window. That evening she set a second cup of coffee on the table where Everett usually sat, in addition to her own. He had not asked for one. She simply set it there and sat down with her own and opened her notebook to its columns of figures. He came in from the cold 20 minutes later, saw the cup, and sat down without comment. He wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge with a sound like water over stone, low and continuous and old. Neither of them spoke, but the silence that evening had a different quality than the silences before. Something had been acknowledged in it that neither of them had put into words, and neither of them needed to. The first time Wren went into Copper Creek alone was on a Thursday in late October, when Everett needed a specific gauge of wire for the fence repair and sent her down with the supply list because his shoulder was giving him trouble. She tied Briar at the post outside Pruitt's store and went in. The store was warm and smelled of tobacco and cured leather and the particular mustiness of dry goods kept in a closed space through many seasons. 3 women stood near the fabric bolts at the back. They went quiet when the door opened. Mabel Pruitt stood behind the counter with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something and is gratified to see it arrive. She filled the order without comment, moving through each item with practiced efficiency. Then she set the last tin on the counter and looked at Wren with the direct assessment of a woman who has decided that honesty is a form of charity. "You know what happened to the last woman up on that ridge," she said. Not unkindly, not kindly either. Simply as a person states a fact they consider relevant. "She died," Wren said, "in March of 1869. He rode 3 days through a blizzard to get her medicine and arrived 2 days after she was gone." Mabel Pruitt blinked. "He told you that," she said. "Yes." A pause. The 3 women at the fabric bolts were very still. Said Mabel Pruitt. She pushed the last tin across the counter. "Wires in the back." Wren carried everything to the horse herself. As she was tying the last saddlebag, she heard the store door open behind her. She did not turn around. She heard Mabel Pruitt's voice, directed at someone inside. "She knows about Miriam." Wren mounted and rode north toward the ridge. The sky above Calloway Ridge held weather that had not yet decided what to do with itself. She rode into it without hurrying. The storm arrived in the first week of November without much warning. The sky had been low and gray for 2 days, heavy with the particular weight that meant serious snow. Everett read it correctly at dawn on a Tuesday and told Wren before he left that he needed to check the fence line on the eastern boundary before the weather closed in. He expected to be back by mid-afternoon. By 4 o'clock, the sky had gone the color of iron and the temperature had dropped hard. By 5, the first snow was falling, not the gentle kind, but the driven kind, horizontal and sharp, the kind that found every gap in a coat and every crack in a wall. By 6, the world outside the window had gone completely white, and the wind was hitting the cabin in long, shuddering gusts that made the lamp flames press sideways in their glass. Wren kept the fire high. She reheated the beans from supper and kept them warm on the back of the stove. She ground fresh coffee and kept that warm too. She did not pace. She sat at the table with her notebook and worked through her figures with the steady concentration of someone who knew that worrying used the same energy as working, and only one of those produced anything useful. The clock on the shelf ticked past 6, past 7, past 8. At 8:30, she closed the notebook. She sat with her hands flat on the embroidered cloth and listened to the storm. At 9:15, the door burst open. He came in on a gust of snow and cold air that swept across the floor and set the lamp flames leaping. His shoulders were white. His beard was crusted with ice along the jaw. He moved with the careful, controlled movement of a man managing pain. And she saw it at once, the way his right shoulder sat lower than the left, the way his right arm held itself slightly away from his body, favoring something. She was already at the stove before the door was fully closed. She poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out as he pushed the door shut against the wind with his shoulder, and leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, the cold coming off him in waves. She did not reach for his coat. She did not fuss at him. She simply held the cup out at the height his hand would find it, without him having to reach. His gloved hand closed around it. Their fingers brushed. Just the tips, through the thick leather of his glove and the thin cotton of her sleeve. Both of them went still for a half-second. Then he lifted the cup and drank. "You did not have to wait up," he said. His voice was rough from the cold. "I was not waiting," she replied. She turned back to the stove and began ladling beans into a bowl. "I was not tired." He said nothing to that. He stood where he was and drank the coffee slowly, letting the heat work its way through him. She could see the rigidity in his shoulders beginning to loosen fraction by fraction as the warmth reached him. She set the bowl on the table. "Sit down," she said, not a command, an offer dressed as a practical suggestion. He sat. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man very hungry and very cold, who is pretending to be neither. She refilled his cup without being asked. He drank it without looking up. When the bowl was empty, he sat back and let out a slow breath, and for a moment he simply existed in the warmth, eyes half closed, the color coming back into his face by degrees. "The posts held," he said. "Good. Managed to get 2 of the weaker ones braced before it came in. Should last until spring." "Good," she said again. He looked at her across the table, not the quick, assessing glance he usually used, the one that catalogued and moved on, but something slower, something that stayed. She met it without flinching. "Coffee is good," he said. "It has been on the stove some time." "I know." His voice had changed slightly, still quiet, still reserved, but with some quality in it that had not been there before. Something careful, something that was not nothing. "I know it has." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked down at the table and set his cup down with the deliberate gentleness of a man who is paying attention to his own hands. She looked at the embroidered cloth between them. Her mother had made it the year before she died, sitting in the kitchen in the late afternoon light, working the daisies with the small, precise movements of someone who knew how to make beautiful things out of very little. Wren had watched her do it. She had not known then that she was memorizing it. She knew now. In the morning, she found the blue glass bottle of camphor liniment she had placed on the shelf 3 weeks ago and never mentioned. It had been there, untouched, where she had left it. This morning, it was on the table, the stopper replaced with care. The level inside it had dropped by half. She put it back on the shelf without comment. She poured his coffee and went about the morning without saying a word, and he came down the ladder and drank the coffee and went outside, and neither of them acknowledged what both of them knew. That was the second thing that changed between them. The first had been that he had let her take the coffee pot. The second was the liniment, used in private and left where she would see it. The third came on a gray afternoon in the middle of November, when Wren went out to the woodshed for an armful of split pine and came back to find him sitting at the table with her notebook open in front of him. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He had not been reading it in the way of someone prying. He had opened it to the back pages where she had been working, and he was looking at the columns of figures with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not anger. It was not suspicion. It was something closer to confusion. The expression of a man who has picked up something familiar and found it heavier than expected. She came inside and set the wood by the stove without hurrying. She shrugged off her coat and hung it on the right peg, the one that was always empty, because it had never occurred to her until this moment that she had not yet claimed a peg for herself and had been leaving her coat across the chair back instead. She sat down across from him. He turned the notebook toward her. On the page, in her own handwriting, a column of figures stopped partway down. Below it, written in the margin in a different hand, a single correction. 3 digits changed. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "I did not find it," he said. "It was with the supply invoice from Pruitt's store. The writer brought both together last Tuesday." She looked at the correction. She had seen it before. She had spent 2 evenings running the numbers backward and forward to determine whether the alteration was an error or a deliberate misrepresentation. She knew which it was. "Those are not your figures," she said. "No," he agreed. "They are not." She looked up at him. His face was still, the kind of still that was not calm but contained. "The debt figure on the original contract was $340, she said carefully. "Due in the spring, but the figure in the supply ledger at Pruitt's store does not agree with the figure in your copy of the contract, and the figure in this margin does not agree with either of them." He was quiet. "Someone has been adjusting the numbers," she said, "in more than one place. Going back, at least since August." The wind pushed against the cabin wall. The fire ticked in the stove. "You have known this," he said. It was not an accusation. "I suspected it," she said. "I have been confirming it." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze steadily and let him look. She had told him almost nothing about herself in the 3 weeks they had shared this cabin. She had offered the practical facts, the years in Cincinnati, the death of Arthur, the absence of children, and nothing more. She had not told him about the law office. She had not told him about the 5 years she had spent working in Arthur's shadow, reading contracts and drafting briefs and cross-referencing land records, while Arthur put his name on the results and accepted the credit. She had not told him that she could look at a column of figures the way a reader looks at a sentence and know immediately when something was grammatically wrong. She had not told him any of it, but she had been using it every day. He closed the notebook. He slid it back across the table toward her. "All right," he said. 2 words, but the weight in them was the weight of a man who has spent 13 years trusting only himself, deciding carefully and deliberately to extend that trust 1 inch in a direction he had not planned. She took the notebook. She did not say, "Thank you." She understood that what had just happened did not require thanks. It required only that she not waste it. "I will need to see the full ledger from Pruitt's store," she said, "and any other correspondence from the railroad." He was quiet again. "There has been correspondence from the railroad," she said. Not a question. He stood and went to the shelf on the east wall. Behind the second row of tins, flat against the back of the shelf where it would not be seen, unless someone knew to look, was a letter. Folded once, the edges gone soft from handling. He took it down and set it on the table in front of her without a word. She unfolded it. Northern Pacific Railroad. Dated September the 3rd, 1882. Signed by a man whose name she did not yet recognize. She read it through once quickly, then again slowly. Then she set it down and looked at the fire and thought. "You did not answer this," she said. "No, but you kept it." "I burned the first 2, he said. "I kept the 3rd because I thought it might be useful to have a record of what they were claiming." She looked up at him. There it was again, that thing she kept finding in him when she was not expecting it. The intelligence behind the silence, the precision behind the stillness. He was not an uncomplicated man. He was a man who had made himself appear uncomplicated because complication required vulnerability, and vulnerability required trust. And trust was the one thing he had stopped offering the world a long time ago. She folded the letter back along its existing creases and held it out to him. He shook his head slightly. "You keep it," he said. She did. That night was the night of the wooden box. She had not been looking for it. She had been sweeping the floor near the base of the ladder, working the broom into the corners where grit accumulated, when the bristles caught on something in the shadow of the lowest rung. She crouched and found it with her fingers. Plain pine, small enough to carry in one hand, dark with the oil of years of being handled and set down and handled again. She should have left it where it was. She opened it instead. Inside, fitted into the box with the careful arrangement of things that matter, a photograph in a cracked brass frame, the image gone slightly soft with age, a young woman with serious eyes and an expression that was not quite smiling and not quite not. A gold band, plain, worn thin on the inside from years of being on a finger. And beneath both of these, a letter, folded very small, the creases worn through in 2 places from being opened and closed so many times that the paper had gone translucent at the folds. Wren did not unfold the letter. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she looked at the ring. Then she closed the box and placed it back exactly as she had found it, in the shadow of the lowest rung, and stood and finished sweeping. She did not mention it at supper. She did not mention it after supper. She sat at the table with her notebook, and Everett sat across from her sharpening the same knife he had been sharpening for a week, and they existed in the familiar silence of their evenings together. But Everett moved differently that night. She noticed a stiffness in his posture that had nothing to do with the cold, a quality of attention directed inward rather than outward. He knew the box had been moved. She had replaced it precisely, but some things are known not by evidence, but by feeling. The way a person always knows when someone else has been in a room, even after everything has been put back. He climbed the ladder early. She sat by the fire a long time after he was gone. On the 3rd night after the box, near the end of November, when the snow outside had built itself up against the north wall to the height of the windowsill and the cold had settled into the kind of permanent, bone-level cold that stopped pretending it would ease, Everett set his knife down on the table. He did not say anything for a moment. The fire spoke. The wind spoke. The cabin held its breath around them. Her name was Miriam, he said. Wren did not look up immediately. She set her pencil down with the same care with which he had set the knife. She folded her hands on the table. Then she looked at him. He was looking at the fire. His face was in partial shadow, the line of his jaw lit orange on one side and dark on the other. And he had the expression of a man who has started something he is not sure he can finish, but has decided to finish it anyway, because the starting was already the hardest part. March of '69, he said. We had a hard winter that year. Late cold. The kind that comes back after you think it is done. He paused. She had been coughing since January. I thought it was the usual. By February, I knew it was not the usual. Wren sat without moving. I went down the mountain for medicine. 3 days down, 3 days back in that weather. 6 days total. His voice was even. She understood what that evenness cost. I made good time. I rode through a night to make good time. The fire. She was gone 2 days before I got back, he said. Neighbor woman had come up to check on her and found her. He looked down at the table. If I had gone a week earlier, if I had read it right in January. He stopped. You read it as well as anyone could have, Wren said, quietly, without inflation. I should have read it better. You went for medicine the moment you knew it was serious. You rode through a night to come back faster. She held his gaze when he finally raised it. You did what you were capable of doing. What you were capable of was not enough to save her. Those are two separate things. He looked at her for a long time. The kind of looking that has weight to it, that presses against the thing being looked at and waits to see if it holds. She held. 13 years, he said finally. His voice was different now, quieter, the way a voice goes when it is saying something true that it has not said aloud before. I told myself I was strong because I was alone, that the mountain asked nothing of me, and I owed it nothing back, and that was a reasonable life. A breath. I was not strong. I was just careful. She looked at him across the embroidered cloth, across the lamplight, across everything that divided people who had not yet chosen to be known. I spent 5 years invisible, she said. Not hidden. Invisible. Arthur did not see me because I had learned to make myself small enough that seeing me required effort, and he was not a man who spent effort on things that did not advance him. She paused. When he died, I did not grieve. I felt nothing at all, and that frightened me more than grief would have. Everett was very still across from her. That is why I answered your advertisement, she said. Not because I had nowhere else to go, though that was also true. Because I thought that if I could make myself useful to someone who needed usefulness, I might remember what it felt like to matter. The fire burned low between them. I see you, he said. The words were plain and direct and said without performance, in the voice of a man who chose his words the way he chose his tools for what they could actually do. Her breath caught once, then steadied. Outside, the storm held the mountain in both hands and pressed. Inside, something that had been carefully locked for a very long time turned, very slightly, in its housing. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither of them needed to. What had already happened, and both of them knew it. And both of them sat with that knowledge in the warmth of the fire, while the November dark pressed its face against the glass. He said good night eventually. He climbed the ladder. She sat for a while longer, her hands folded on the embroidered cloth her mother had made the year before she died, and she looked at the fire and let herself feel the full weight of what had just been offered and what she had offered in return. It was more than she had expected. It was more, she thought, than either of them had expected. She blew out the lamp and went to her room and lay in the dark. She lay for a long time without sleeping, not from worry, from the unfamiliar weight of having been seen, fully and without flinching, by someone she had not yet finished learning to trust. It was a heavier thing than she had expected. It was also, she thought, the right kind of heavy, the kind that meant something was real. She listened to the mountain and let it be real. The morning after Miriam's name was spoken aloud for the first time in 13 years, neither of them mentioned it. This was by agreement, though no agreement had been made. Some things, once said, do not need to be carried further into the daylight. They exist best in the place where they were spoken, in the firelight and the late hour and the particular courage that comes when the dark is deep enough and the cold close enough that the ordinary protections stop being worth the effort of maintaining. Everett came down the ladder. The coffee was ready. He stood by the window and looked out at the snow and drank it. And Wren finished the morning biscuits, and at the door, before he went out to the east fence line, he paused. He did not turn around fully. Just enough. "East fence line today," he said, "back before noon." He had never told her his plans before. He had simply gone and returned, and that had been the whole of it. She had learned his schedule by watching, not by being told. She looked at the back of his coat and felt the full weight of those 3 words, which was not information about his schedule, but the first voluntary offering of himself into her day, the first acknowledgement that his absence would be noted and his return expected, and that both of these things were no longer inconveniences to be managed, but facts to be shared. "I will have dinner ready," she said. He went out. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. Nothing dramatic had changed. The work was the same. The silence was the same. The rhythm of their days moved in the same grooves it had always moved in. But the silence itself had changed in the way that silence changes when it is no longer the absence of something, but the presence of something that does not need words to exist. He began telling her small things, not confessions, not conversations, just small pieces of information offered in passing, the way a person opens a window a crack to let the air change without committing to the cold. The gray mare in the 3rd stall had a stone bruise healing on her left foreleg. He was keeping her off hard ground until spring. The fence line on the north pasture had been repaired in the fall of '79 and would likely need replacing in another 2 years. The stand of lodgepole pine at the back of the property ran another 1/4 mile further east than the property line, and he had never cleared it because the deer wintered there, and he saw no reason to take something from a creature that had nothing else. Wren listened to all of it. She did not make much of any of it. She simply received each small piece and placed it carefully in the growing map she was making of this man and this mountain, and what they were to each other. She told him small things in return. Her mother had taught her the embroidery on the cloth. Yellow daisies because they were the first flower her mother had learned to stitch, and she had never moved on to anything more complicated because she said the daisies were already exactly right. She had taught herself to read financial documents by sitting in the back of Arthur's office for 2 years before he noticed she was useful enough to involve directly, and by that point, she had already understood more than he had intended her to. She preferred the morning to every other time of day because in the morning nothing had gone wrong yet. He heard all of it. He did not make much of any of it. But the map he was making of her grew alongside the one she was making of him, and neither of them commented on the fact that they were both mapping, and both of them knew it. Then December turned serious. The cold that came in the 2nd week of December was not the cold of October or November. It was a different animal entirely. It came without wind, which was worse. Wind at least announced itself and moved on. This cold simply settled, thick and total and silent, pressing down on the mountain from above as though the sky itself had frozen and descended. The thermometer on the porch post read 16 below on a Wednesday morning and did not climb above 0 for 11 days. On the 3rd day of the deep cold, Everett went out before dawn to check on the livestock in the barn and did not come back for 2 hours. When he returned, his hands were shaking hard enough that he could not work the door latch, and Wren opened it from inside and stepped back to let him in. He stood in the middle of the floor and shook. She did not say anything. She went to the stove and pushed the temperature up as high as the iron would take it. and she brought the extra wool blanket from her room and put it around his shoulders, and she put his hands, still gloved, between both of hers and held them. He looked down at her hands holding his. She did not let go. After a while, the shaking slowed. After a while longer, it stopped. "Calf came early," he said. His voice was still rough from the cold. "Had to stay until it was on its feet." She released his hands. She poured coffee. She set it in front of him and sat down across the table and watched him come back to himself degree by degree. "Is it all right?" she asked. He looked up, slightly surprised by the question, as though the outcome of the calf had not occurred to him as something she might care about. "Yes," he said, "small but sound." She nodded. Something moved in his expression, not the ghost of an expression this time, not the controlled almost of earlier weeks, something more complete, something that looked, briefly, like warmth. The gray mare recovered before the end of January. Wren saw it one morning when she came into the barn and found the horse standing squarely on all 4 feet, weight distributed evenly, no longer favoring the left foreleg. She stood at the stall door and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back inside and reported the fact to Everett without embellishment. And he said good, and that was the whole of it. And yet the word carried in it a kind of shared satisfaction that was not about the horse at all. There were small victories like this scattered through the weeks, things that would not have registered as victories to anyone who had not been paying attention. The calf gaining weight. The east trough holding for 3 days before it needed breaking again, which meant the seam where the trough had split was finally closing in the cold, as she had hoped it would. The poultice working. The liniment working. The knee, under the weekly assessment, she continued to perform whether Everett welcomed it or not, showing signs of stability that a real physician might not have trusted, but that she trusted because she had been watching it every day for 6 weeks, and she knew what it had looked like at its worst, and she knew what it looked like now. She did not tell him any of her private assessments. She only told him what the next stage of treatment required and what he could and could not attempt. He followed her instructions with the precision of a man who had accepted that she knew more about this particular subject than he did, and he never pretended otherwise, and she understood that this was its own kind of trust, quieter than the trust he had extended when he slid the notebook back across the table and said, "All right, but not smaller." It was during the long evenings of those weeks, when Everett could sit up but not stand, and the cabin was warm from the fire she kept high, and the lamp was full, and there was nowhere either of them needed to be, that Wren began to understand something she had not understood before. Something about what it meant to share a space with another person, not out of obligation, but out of choice. In Arthur's house, the evenings had been exercises in parallel isolation. Arthur in his study with his papers, she in the sitting room with her mending or her reading, the space between them a distance measured not in feet, but in the complete absence of any reason to cross it. She had not known in those years that an evening could be different. She had thought that what she and Arthur had was simply what evenings were. She knew better now. An evening was this: the fire in the stove, the lamp on the table, the scratch of her pencil and the slower sounds of his work. 2 people in the same room because they had both arrived there separately and found, on arriving, that the room was better for containing both of them. She did not have a word for what this was. She did not think it needed one. Words were for things that required clarification. This required only continuation. It was the morning of December the 19th, when Wren found the letter in the supply delivery. The rider from Copper Creek came every 2 weeks with goods from Pruitt's store. Wren was the one who met him at the porch because Everett was out at the barn. The rider handed over the crate and a bundle of mail and touched his hat and rode off before the cold could get him, the way riders did in December when horses had opinions about standing still in 16 below. Wren carried everything inside. She sorted the mail on the table, a bill from the hardware merchant in Helena, a circular from the land office, and at the bottom of the bundle, a plain envelope addressed in handwriting she recognized, not from Montana, from Ohio. She stood at the table and looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she turned it over. No return address. But the postmark was Cincinnati, and the handwriting on the front, the particular way the capital W was formed with that small hook at the top of the left stem, she had seen that handwriting on ledger pages for 5 years. She opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper. 11 words. Do not interfere. Return to Cincinnati while you are still able. She read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the pocket of her apron and stood very still at the table for a moment and thought with the focused precision of a person who has learned that the first response to a threat is not fear, but inventory. What did this mean? Who had sent it? What did they know? What were they protecting? She knew the handwriting. She knew who had employed that hand. She knew the name attached to that hand. And she knew what that name was connected to. And she knew, standing in the cold kitchen of a cabin on a Montana mountain 13 years removed from anything that should have reached her here, that the thing she had walked away from in Cincinnati had not finished with her yet. She did not tell Everett that evening. She was not keeping it from him. She was building the full shape of it first. Because walking into a room and saying someone has threatened me without being able to say this is what they want and this is what they will do next was the kind of information that generated fear without direction. And fear without direction was not useful to either of them. She took out her notebook instead and began a new set of columns. What she knew, what she suspected, what she needed to confirm. The list under what she needed to confirm was longer than the other two. She needed to see the full ledger from Pruitt's store. She needed to know who had been asking about Callaway Ridge in Copper Creek. And she needed to find the connection between the adjusted debt figures, the railroad correspondence, and the name behind the handwriting on that envelope. She worked through the evening until the lamp oil ran low. Everett watched her from across the table without appearing to watch her. He had learned her working posture by now, the way her shoulders set slightly differently when she was concentrating on something difficult, the way the pencil moved in short, precise strokes when she was calculating and long, flowing ones when she was writing. Tonight the strokes were short. Whatever she was working on, it was not simple. He said nothing. He trusted her to tell him when she had something to tell. That trust, offered without being asked for and without conditions attached, was not a small thing. Wren felt the weight of it across the table and worked harder to deserve it. She did not sleep well that night. At 2 a.m, she lay in the dark of her narrow room and listened to the wind that had finally arrived to relieve the silence of the deep cold. And she thought about the 11 words on the plain sheet of paper, and she thought about what came next. She did not feel afraid. She had felt afraid in Cincinnati, standing in the parlor of Arthur's family home with her coat on and her single bag at her feet, while Arthur's brother explained in the measured tones of a man accustomed to being obeyed that her presence in this house was no longer required or desired, and that she had until Friday to be gone. She had felt afraid then because she had nothing and no one, and no ground to stand on. She was standing on ground now. She looked at the ceiling of her narrow room in the dark and felt, underneath the alertness and the calculation and the quiet anger she was allowing herself in the privacy of the 2 o'clock dark, something that surprised her. She felt resolved. It was the morning of January the 6th when Everett did not come back on time. He had gone out at first light to check the fence line on the eastern boundary. He had said he would be back by mid-morning. The sky was clear for the first time in a week, and he wanted to check the east slope before another system moved in from the north. By 10 o'clock, the sky was still clear, and he had not returned. By 11, Wren was standing at the south window watching the tree line. By 11:30, she had her coat and boots on. She found him a quarter-mile from the cabin on the eastern slope below the ridge line. The slope had given way, not dramatically, not the way slopes gave way in spring thaw, but quietly, the way frozen ground gives way when the subsurface pressure builds without any surface warning. A section of hillside, perhaps 20 feet wide, had slid 6 feet down and taken 2 large boulders with it, and Everett was pinned between them. His right leg caught at an angle that made her stomach turn once, hard, before she locked the reaction away and moved toward him. His face was white, not pale, white. The particular white of a man who has been lying in frozen ground for an unknown amount of time, and whose body has made decisions about where to send its warmth, and his leg was not among them. "Wren," he said. The word came out compressed, worked down to its smallest possible size by the effort it cost him. She dropped to her knees beside him and put 2 fingers to the pulse at his wrist. Weak but steady, she ran her eyes over him with the quick inventory she had learned from her mother's medical book when she was 12 years old and had read every time she was frightened of something she did not understand, because understanding was the only medicine available to her then. He was conscious. His breathing was controlled, the way a man controls his breathing when the alternative is to stop controlling it. The leg was the primary problem. The cold was the secondary problem. The secondary problem would become the primary problem within the hour. "I am going to move the rock," she said. Not a question. A statement of what was about to happen. "It is heavy," he said. "I know." She found a fallen pine branch at the tree line, thick enough to hold, long enough to use as a lever. She worked the end of it under the edge of the larger boulder and braced the fulcrum point with a smaller stone and put her weight on the far end. The boulder did not move. She reset the fulcrum. Tried again. The boulder moved 1/2 inch and settled back. She reset again, repositioned herself. Her boots found purchase in the frozen ground. She looked at him. "When I lift," she said, "pull straight back, not sideways, straight back." He nodded once. The compression in his face had gone beyond pain into something more fundamental, the expression of a person operating entirely on the decision to continue. She put everything she had onto the branch. The boulder moved, 2 inches, 3. "Now," she said. The sound he made when he pulled his leg free was not a word. It was the kind of sound that lives below language, in the part of a person that exists before they learn to contain themselves. She heard it and kept her weight on the branch until she heard the dragging sound of him moving clear, and then she stepped back and let the boulder settle and turned to find him on his hands and one knee in the snow, the other leg extended behind him, head down, breathing in long, ragged pulls. She crouched beside him and put her hand on his back. He did not shrug it off. She got him upright. She got his arm across her shoulders and her arm around his waist, and she began walking him back toward the cabin. He could put partial weight on the leg, which meant the bone was not broken clean through, but each step cost him visibly, and she felt the cost of it through her shoulder where his arm pressed down. They walked for 2 hours, not because the cabin was 2 hours away, because they could only move as fast as he could move, which was very slowly, and because twice he needed to stop and wait for the waves of pain to recede enough to let him continue, and she stood beside him each time with his weight leaning into her and said nothing and waited. And when he was ready, she walked him forward again. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, she felt something release in her chest that she had not known she had been holding. Inside, she rebuilt the fire to its maximum and helped him to the bed in her room because it was closer to the stove, and she was not going to carry him up a ladder. She cut away the lower leg of his trousers with her sewing shears. The knee was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin pulled tight and dark. The joint was intact, but the ligaments had been stretched and possibly torn, and the cold had done additional damage that would only become fully apparent over the next 24 hours. She had laudanum in the medicine chest she had brought from Cincinnati, small and brown and nearly full. She measured a careful dose and brought it to him with water. He looked at the spoon. "I need you to be able to tell me if the pain changes," she said. "So take enough to manage it, not enough to sleep through it." He took the dose she offered. She worked for the next hour cleaning and binding the knee with the strip she cut from her second dress, the gray wool she had traveled in, because it was the cleanest fabric available and cotton would not hold the shape of the binding the way wool would. She worked with focused efficiency, and he watched her face while she worked, her expression closed and concentrated, and entirely without the particular kind of pity that would have been unbearable to him. When she was finished, she sat back and looked at her work. "You will not walk normally for 6 weeks," she said. "You will not walk at all for the first 2. He said nothing. "I will manage the barn," she said. "Tell me what needs to be done in what order, and I will do it." "The calf needs checking morning and night," he said after a moment. "All right." "The water in the east trough freezes overnight. Needs breaking every morning before the stock can drink." "All right." "The gray mare needs the stone bruise checked every 3 days. There is a poultice recipe on the shelf above the medicine chest." "I will find it." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. "Wren," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Mrs. Voss, not the formal address of a man observing a careful distance. Her name, the short version of it, the one that fit in a single breath. "I know," she said quietly, before he could say whatever he had been going to say, because she already knew what it was, and she wanted him to know that she knew, that he did not need to spend the words, that between them now some things could be known without the cost of saying them. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he let his head fall back against the pillow and closed his eyes. She pulled the extra blanket over him and went to the stove to start supper. The weeks that followed were the longest and the most complete of anything Wren had experienced since she was a child in her mother's house. She did everything: water and wood and cooking and barn work and bandage changes and the twice daily assessment of the knee that told her, day by day, that the healing was proceeding as well as it could without a physician's intervention. Everett was a difficult patient in the way that competent men are always difficult patients, because they know precisely what they cannot do, and the knowledge sits badly on them. He snapped at her twice in the first week. Both times she received the sharpness without returning it, and went on with what she had been doing. And by the third day, he had stopped snapping, and had started instead saying please, which she suspected was considerably more difficult for him than the snapping had been. By the third week, he was saying thank you with the regularity of a man who has decided that something which costs him effort is worth the cost. One night in the second week, near midnight, she fell asleep in the chair beside his bed. She had been sitting with him through a difficult hour. The knee had swollen again from the inflammation that came and went in cycles, and she had been monitoring his color and his temperature and the quality of his breathing, and somewhere in the watching, she had simply gone. In the morning, she was still in the chair. His hand was wrapped around hers where it had rested on the edge of the blanket. She came awake slowly, registering the fire and the gray morning light and the warmth of his hand before she registered anything else. She looked at their hands. She looked at his face. He was awake. He had been awake for some time, she thought. His eyes were open and clear, and he was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. She did not move her hand. He did not release it. Outside, the January wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves, and the cabin held them both inside its walls with the particular steadiness of something built by a man who intended it to last, and the fire spoke quietly in the stove, and neither of them said anything at all. And somewhere in that silence, in the gray January morning, with the cold pressing at the glass and the warmth holding at the center, something that had been two separate things became, without ceremony or announcement, one. During those weeks, while Everett healed, Wren had also been working. In the afternoons when he slept, she took out her notebook and continued building the case she had been assembling since November. She had the full shape of it now. Harlan Cresswell, Northern Pacific Railroad. The pattern of a large entity moving against a small one, using procedural confusion and manufactured debt to create the appearance of a legal claim where no legitimate claim existed. And she had something more. The connection between the handwriting on the threatening letter and the name she had been circling for weeks. A name she had first encountered not in Montana but in Cincinnati, in the records of the Voss Law Office, attached to transactions that should not have existed. What she needed was a courtroom. What she needed first was for Everett to be standing again. 8 weeks after the accident, Everett carved himself a cane from a length of white oak he had been saving in the barn for 3 years, without knowing what it was for. He shaped it over 4 evenings, sitting by the stove, while Wren worked at the table across from him. He did not ask for help. She did not offer any. She simply kept the fire high and the lamp full and let him work. The shavings curled to the floor around his boots, and she swept them up each morning without comment, the way she did everything, with the quiet competence of someone who understood that small dignities were not small. On the 5th morning, he stood up from the bed in her room, where he had slept for 8 weeks, and put the cane under his right hand, and crossed to the window. She was at the stove. She heard him stand. She heard the cane find the floor. She did not turn around. He reached the window and looked out at the February morning, at the snow on the ridge and the pale sky above it and the long, empty valley below. He stood there for a moment. "The mare will need her stone bruise checked today," he said. "I checked it yesterday," Wren said. "The poultice is holding. Another week and she should be sound." He was quiet. "The east trough?" he asked. "Broken this morning. Stock has water." "The calf?" "Growing," she said. "Eating well. Getting bold." She heard him exhale, not with relief exactly, with something more complicated than relief. The sound of a man confronting the fact that the world had continued to function in his absence and feeling two things about that simultaneously: gratitude and the particular quiet grief of a man whose necessity has been successfully replaced. She turned around. He was standing at the window with his back to her and his weight on the cane, and his free hand pressed flat against the glass the way a person presses a hand against glass when they need something solid to push back. "The ranch is still here," she said. "So are you. That is what matters." He did not answer, but the hand against the glass eased slightly. She turned back to the stove. That morning, he walked the length of the cabin 7 times, back and forth between the north wall and the south, the cane taking part of his weight, the damaged knee taking the rest. The first crossing took him 3 minutes. By the 7th, he was down to 90 seconds, and the color was high in his face, and sweat had broken out along his jaw despite the cold. She watched from the table where she was working and said nothing. She had learned by now that commentary on his effort was not wanted, that what he needed from her in these moments was not encouragement but witness, to be seen doing the work without being praised for it, the way serious people always prefer to be seen. By the end of the 2nd week, he was crossing the yard to the barn under his own power. The cane went with him, but the cane was no longer a concession. It was simply a tool, the way the axe was a tool and the fence pliers were a tool, something useful that a practical man used without shame. It was on one of these mornings, the 2nd Monday of February, when the sky was the particular pale blue of a cold, clear day with no weather behind it, that Wren looked up from her notebook and saw him through the window. He was crossing the yard toward the barn, moving carefully on the packed snow, and his posture had changed. Not fully. Not the posture of the man she had first met at the Copper Creek station in October, but something approaching it. Something that was beginning, cautiously and without announcement, to resemble the man who had been there before the grief got into him. She watched him until he was inside the barn. Then she looked down at her notebook. At the top of the current page, in her careful columns, was the name she had been circling for 2 weeks: Harlan Cresswell. She had the full shape of it now. She closed the notebook and put down her pencil and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the embroidered cloth. She had been protecting him from the full picture while he healed. That had been the right decision for 8 weeks. It was no longer the right decision. He was standing again. He was working again. And what was coming would require both of them to be standing at the same time. She was still sitting there when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them, the muffled percussion of hooves on packed snow. More than one horse, moving with the deliberate rhythm of people who have a destination and intend to arrive at it. She went to the window. 3 riders came out of the tree line. The man in front was not from Copper Creek. His coat was the kind of coat that was purchased in a city by a man who understood the importance of being taken seriously before he opened his mouth. Dark wool, well cut, with a fur collar that spoke of expenditure rather than necessity. He rode a blood bay horse that was too good for mountain trails. A gold watch chain caught the February light at his vest. Behind him, 2 men with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to men who were paid not to think, but to be present and large. Wren had never seen Harlan Cresswell in person, but she had read his signature on a document 8 months ago in a Cincinnati courtroom, and she had no difficulty whatsoever connecting that signature to the man on the blood bay horse coming across the yard of Calloway Ridge on a cold February morning. She went to the door of the barn. "Everett," she said through the gap. Her voice was level. "Come inside, now." He came out of the barn with the cane under his hand and read her face and said nothing. They went inside together. She told him in 2 minutes, standing in the middle of the cabin while the riders crossed the last of the yard. Everything she had pieced together. The adjusted figures, the forged ledger entries, the railroad letter, the name behind the Cincinnati postmark, and what she believed Cresswell intended to claim. She told him in the flat, sequential manner of a person presenting a legal summary, without editorializing, without apology for having held it back. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was processing something difficult without letting the difficulty show. "All right," he said. Then the knock came at the door. Everett went to the door. He opened it. Cresswell stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, and his expression arranged into the particular configuration of a man who has learned to make the exercise of power look like reasonable conversation. He was perhaps 50, with a broad face and pale eyes, and the easy posture of someone who had won most of the arguments he had entered. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His voice was smooth with practice. "Harlan Cresswell, Northern Pacific Railroad. I apologize for arriving without prior notice. The matter is somewhat time-sensitive." Everett said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway with the cane under his right hand and waited. Cresswell unfolded a document from inside his coat. "The territorial government has authorized land acquisition along the projected route of the new rail spur through this valley. According to our survey, Calloway Ridge sits directly in the path of the planned corridor. Furthermore, our legal team has identified an irregularity in the original federal registration of this property. Without proof of continuous and legal claim, the land reverts to public domain under the Territorial Land Act." Everett reached for the document with his right hand. His right hand was the hand that also held the cane. The reach was too far. His weight shifted wrong. The cane slipped on the porch boards, and he went down hard, first to one knee, then to both hands, the document skittering across the porch floor. The sound of it was very loud in the cold, quiet morning. He stayed down for 3 full seconds. Wren, standing just inside the door, felt the 3 seconds in her chest like something physical. She knew what it cost him to be on his hands and knees on his own porch in front of this man. She knew it with the precise understanding of a woman who had spent 5 years being made small and knew exactly what smallness felt like from the inside and from the outside, both. Cresswell looked down at him with the expression of a man who is professionally sympathetic and personally satisfied. "Perhaps," he said gently, "you should sit down, Mr. Calloway. We can conduct this conversation more comfortably inside." Wren stepped through the doorway and onto the porch. She did not touch Everett. She did not reach down to help him because he did not want her help to stand, and she knew that, and she respected it. She stood beside him, close enough that her presence registered, and she looked at Harlan Cresswell with the clear gray eyes that had been looking at men like him for 5 years in a Cincinnati law office and had long since finished being impressed. "My husband will stand when he is ready," she said. Cresswell blinked. His eyes moved to her as though he had not fully registered her existence until this moment. "Your husband," he said, with the faint inflection of a man recalibrating. "Everett Calloway," she replied. "We were married in Hamilton County, Ohio, in the spring of 1882. I have the certificate inside, if you require it." Cresswell recovered smoothly. He was a man who recovered smoothly. "That will be a matter for the court to verify." Behind her, she heard the sound of the cane finding the porch boards. Then the sound of Everett standing. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Cresswell's face and waited until she felt Everett's presence at her left shoulder, standing beside her, his weight collected and his face composed. She stepped down from the porch and faced Cresswell squarely. "You mentioned legal irregularity," she said. "I would like to discuss that document." She nodded toward the paper that had fallen to the porch floor. One of the men behind Cresswell retrieved it and held it out. She took it. She read it at the speed of a person who had read a great many documents of this type and knew exactly where to look for what mattered. She found it in 14 seconds. "Federal land acquisition documents have carried a red seal since January of 1875, she said. "This seal is blue." She held the document out so that Cresswell could see his own paper. "This is not an authorized federal document." The silence that followed had a texture to it. The two men behind Cresswell exchanged a glance that was brief and not brief enough. Cresswell's voice lost a degree of its smoothness, but held its shape. "You are mistaken. I worked in a land law office in Cincinnati for 5 years, Wren said. "I have read several hundred federal land documents. I am not mistaken." A moment passed. Then Cresswell looked at her with an expression that was no longer professionally sympathetic. He had recalibrated again, and the new calibration was colder. "I know who you are, Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was quiet now, the quietness of a man who has decided to change instruments. "And I know why you left Cincinnati. I would think carefully before presenting yourself as a credible legal authority in any proceeding connected to Northern Pacific Railroad." The morning air held the words. Wren felt them land. She felt the weight behind them, the specific weight of a threat that has been prepared in advance, that has a shape and a plan attached to it, not improvised but carried here from a long distance and set down at this moment with precision. She did not look at Everett. She did not need to. She held Cresswell's pale eyes and let the silence stretch one beat past comfortable. "We will see you in court, Mr. Cresswell," she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and mounted the blood bay horse, and the three of them rode back across the yard and into the tree line, and were gone. The yard was very quiet. Wren stood in the cold and did not move for a moment. She could feel her heart beating in a way she did not allow herself to feel while he was standing in front of her. Everett came down the porch steps and stood beside her. "He knows about Cincinnati," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. Tell me." She turned and looked at him. 13 years of closed doors. The man who had taken the cane without asking for help and used it without apology. The man who had stood at her left shoulder on the porch. Upright, present, offering the only thing she had actually needed, which was to not be alone. She told him. Not the abbreviated version she had given him before the knock came. The full version. Arthur's practice and the railroad contracts and the pattern she had identified in the land filings and the report she had made to the circuit court judge in September of 1881. The retaliation that had followed Arthur's death, the accusations manufactured by his family, the document they had filed with the court claiming she had removed privileged materials from the office without authorization, the loss of everything that had followed. Her name on a court record in Cincinnati, not convicted. The case had not proceeded that far, but recorded, which in 1882 was sufficient to close most doors. She told him all of it, standing in the February cold of the yard of Calloway Ridge, with the snow bright around them and the sky very blue overhead. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the cold in her hands. "You reported him to protect other people," he said finally. "People who owned land along that railroad route." "Yes." "And they came after you for it." "Yes." He looked at the tree line where Cresswell had disappeared. "The document they filed against you in Cincinnati," he said. "Do you have any record of it?" "I have my copy of the original report I filed with the judge," she said. "I kept a carbon. It is dated September the 9th, 1881. The accusation against me was filed by Arthur's brother in November of 1881, 2 months after my report and 6 weeks after Arthur died." She paused. "The sequence of events is documented." He looked at her. "That is what he is afraid of," Everett said. "Yes. He came here to warn you off before it reaches a courtroom." "Yes." He looked at the document she was still holding, the one with the blue seal. "We need Judge Aldrin," he said. "Court sits in Copper Creek on the 3rd Friday of the month." "That is 11 days from now," she said. "Can you be ready in 11 days? She thought about what she had. The original deed, the railroad letter, the adjusted ledger figures and the documentation of the adjustments, the carbon copy of her 1881 report, the threatening note with the Cincinnati postmark, and the forged document currently in her hand with its blue seal that should have been read. "Yes," she said. The courtroom in Copper Creek was a room above the hardware store that served as courtroom, town meeting hall, and occasional church depending on the day of the week. On the 3rd Friday of February, it was packed to the walls. Copper Creek was not a large town, but it had functional instincts about what mattered, and a proceeding involving the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Calloway Ridge property mattered considerably. Mabel Pruitt sat in the front row with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a woman who has already decided and is waiting for the proceedings to confirm it. Cresswell stood at a polished table with 2 lawyers who had ridden up from Helena. They had the look of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. Everett sat beside Wren at the respondents' table. He had left the cane at the door. His jaw was set and his hands were flat on the table, and he was looking straight ahead with the expression of a man who intends to be present for every second of what is about to happen. Wren had her notebook and a leather folder containing every document she had assembled. She had organized them in the order she intended to use them. Judge Aldrin called the proceeding to order. Cresswell's lawyers presented their case with professional fluency, irregular federal registration, disputed land claim, the authority of the Territorial Land Act. They were good. They had done this before. They moved through their argument with the ease of people who expected the outcome. Then Cresswell himself stood. He presented the accusation from Cincinnati with the manner of a man performing regret. A matter of professional record, he said. He simply felt the court should be aware, before placing weight on the testimony of Mrs. Voss, that there was a documented legal matter in Ohio relating to her conduct in a law office. He was sorry to raise it. He felt it was his obligation. The room shifted. Mabel Pruitt unfolded her hands and refolded them. Everett did not turn his head. He moved his left hand across the table and placed it over Wren's where it rested on the leather folder. Not squeezing, not performing. Simply placing it there, weight and warmth in the plain statement of where he stood. She felt it travel from her hand to somewhere considerably deeper. She opened the folder. She presented the original deed to Callaway Ridge, recorded in the county register in 1871. She presented the telegraph confirmation from Helena of the federal registration, dated 1872. She presented the forged document with its blue seal beside a certified copy of the 1875 federal directive mandating the change to red, which she had requested from the Helena Land Office 10 days ago when she first identified the forgery. Then she placed her carbon copy of the September 1881 report on the table. This document was filed with the Circuit Court in Cincinnati on September the 9th, 1881, she said. It details the pattern of fraudulent land filings I identified in the records of the Voss Law Office, filings made on behalf of Northern Pacific Railroad. She looked at Cresswell. The accusation against my professional conduct was filed 2 months later, in November of 1881, after this report was already part of the court record. The sequence is documented. Cresswell's lead lawyer said something to him in a low voice. Cresswell did not respond. From the third row, a man stood up. He was one of the two who had ridden with Cresswell to Callaway Ridge. The larger one, with a coat that did not quite fit across the shoulders, and the expression of a man who has been making a quiet private decision for several days and has finally arrived at it. "My name is Dade Garver," he said. His voice was not loud, but the room was quiet enough that it carried. "Mr. Cresswell engaged me in January to deliver certain documents to the Copper Creek Supply Office and ensure they were recorded in the ledger. He paid me $40 to do it. The documents adjusted the debt figure on the Callaway Ridge account." He stopped. Then, "I would like to correct the record." The room came apart. Judge Aldrin's gavel came down 3 times before the noise subsided. Cresswell's lead lawyer was on his feet. Cresswell himself sat very still with his pale eyes fixed on the middle distance and the expression of a man recalculating from first principles. The gavel came down again. In the settling that followed, Wren sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the documents in front of her and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. The particular stillness of a person who has done what needed doing and done it correctly, and can now simply let the weight of it rest where it belongs. Beside her, Everett released a breath that seemed to come from somewhere considerably deeper than his lungs. Judge Aldrin ordered an immediate investigation into the ledger alterations and the forged acquisition document. He suspended all Northern Pacific land claims in the valley pending review. He directed Cresswell's lawyers to remain available to the court. Cresswell stood. He moved toward the door with the deliberate composure of a man who has decided that composure is the only thing left available to him. As he passed the respondent's table, he looked at Wren, and the look was not the cold threat of the yard at Callaway Ridge. It was something more final than that. The look of a man who has recognized that he has met something he cannot move, and is in the process of accepting it. He walked to the door. Everett stood. He moved to the door before Cresswell reached it, not quickly, but with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows he will arrive in time and has nothing to prove about it. He stood in the doorway. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood in the space between Cresswell and the outside world, with 13 years of a man's whole life in his eyes. "You came to my land," he said. "You came to my home. You tried to take the one thing I had left." He held Cresswell's gaze without heat, without performance, with only the absolute and undecorated truth of it. "I will not forget that." Cresswell held the look for 3 seconds. Then he walked out. The February air came through the open door and moved through the room, and Everett stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold at his back and the warmth of the room in front of him. Then he turned around. Across the room, through the standing crowd and the noise of the reconvening and Mabel Pruitt's newly complicated expression, Wren was looking at him. He walked back to her. He sat down beside her. Outside the hardware store, the February sun was doing what February sun did in Montana, offering light without warmth, honest about what it was and what it was not. It came through the high windows of the room above and lay across the floor in long, pale rectangles and touched the edge of the table where their hands rested, close but not quite touching, in the particular proximity of two people who have come through something together and have not yet found the words for what that means. They did not need the words yet. They had time. They rode home in the afternoon light. The trail up from Copper Creek climbed through stands of pine that held the snow in their upper branches, and the February sun came at a low angle through the trees and laid long shadows across the path in front of them. Briar moved steadily upward with the patient rhythm of a horse that knew this trail in all conditions and had opinions about none of them. Wren sat behind Everett the way she had on the first night in October, 4 months ago, with the careful distance of someone who had measured the appropriate space between them. But somewhere in the hour since morning, that measurement had changed. She was not holding on to him. She did not hold on to him that way. But the distance between them had gone from careful to simply absent, and neither of them had marked the moment it happened. The valley fell away below. The peaks above Calloway Ridge caught the afternoon light and held it, pale gold against the deep blue of the sky, and the snow on the open ground had a crust to it that glittered where the sun hit it directly. The air was cold and clean and tasted of pine resin and the particular mineral sharpness of high-altitude winter. Neither of them spoke for a long time. This silence was different from all the silences before it. The first silences had been careful, the silences of two people who did not yet know what they were to each other and were trying not to assume. The later silences had been inhabited, full of the small sounds of shared living, the fire and the pencil and the cane on the floor. This silence had none of that carefulness in it. This silence was simply what two people sounded like when they had nothing they needed to defend against each other. "Dade Garver," Everett said after a while. "He made his own decision," Wren said. "I did not know he would." "No." A pause. "But you made it possible for him to, by building the case the way you did, by making it possible for one honest man to change the outcome." She thought about that. "Arthur used to say that legal cases were won by the strongest argument," she said. "I always thought they were won by the most complete record." He was quiet for a moment. "You were right." She did not say anything to that, but something settled in her at the words, quietly and without ceremony, the way things settle when they have been a long time coming, and have finally arrived at their right place. In the days that followed the courtroom, the mountain continued its slow negotiation with the season. The cold did not break all at once, but in stages, degree by degree, the way trust broke or built, which was really the same process moving in opposite directions. A morning would arrive that was cold, but differently cold. The cold of something that had remembered it would not last forever, rather than the cold of something that intended to. The snow on the south face of the ridge retreated an inch, then two. The creek, which had gone entirely silent under its ice in December, began to speak again in a low register, audible only if you stood still and listened for it. Wren stood still and listened for it one afternoon while she was breaking the ice on the east trough, and she heard it, that first murmur of water moving under ice, and she stood there for a moment with the iron bar in her hands and let the sound reach her fully. It was not much. It was barely anything, but it was the sound of something that had been stopped starting again, and she found, standing in the cold of late February with the ice chips white around her boots, that she had a great deal of feeling about that. Everett found her there when he came out from the barn. He stopped beside her without speaking. She did not explain what she was listening to. He cocked his head slightly and listened too. And after a moment she saw, at the corner of his mouth, the expression she had first seen in October when he looked at the woodpile she had rearranged, the ghost of something more complete than he usually permitted himself. She understood it now. She had learned to read him the way she had learned to read the stove, the way she had learned to read the mountain, through patient and attentive observation of small signals that added up over time to something you could rely on. The letter from the attorney arrived at the end of February. She recognized the return address before she opened it and took a moment, standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on from the morning barn work, to prepare herself for what it might contain. It contained less than she feared. The attorney had been informed, by correspondence with Judge Aldrin's office, of the proceedings in Copper Creek and the testimony of Dade Garver. He wrote to advise her that, in light of these developments, his office would be reviewing the matter of the 1881 accusation against her with a view toward its formal withdrawal from the record. He requested no response. He required nothing from her. He was simply informing her. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it on the shelf beside the carved bird, and she stood there looking at both of them for a long moment. The bird with its wings lifted, deciding. The letter that was the closing of a door she had not been able to close herself. She reached up and touched the bird once, lightly, with the tip of one finger. Then she put on the kettle and made coffee, and waited for Everett to come in from the barn. When he came in and saw her face, he knew something had happened. He sat down across from her without being asked, and she told him, and he listened with the same stillness with which he had listened to everything she had ever told him. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It is over then," he said. "The Cincinnati part of it is over," she said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "And the rest of it?" he said. She thought about this honestly. She thought about the woman who had arrived in October with one valise and the practiced habit of making herself small. She thought about everything that had happened since, the mountain and the cold, and the calf, and the liniment, and the boulders, and the courtroom, and the carved bird on the shelf, and the hand over hers in the January dark. "The rest of it," she said, "is here." He looked at the coffee cup, then at the embroidered cloth on the table, then at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." They reached the cabin as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the sky went from gold to the deep, luminous blue that preceded full dark. Everett tied Briar at the post and saw to him before going inside, the same as every evening, in the same order, without variation. Wren went in and built the fire up from its banked state and set the kettle on and stood at the south window and looked out at the valley below while the light finished leaving it. She heard him come in. She heard the cane and the familiar sounds of him removing his coat. The left peg, always the left. She heard him cross the room and stop behind her. She did not turn around immediately. They stood like that for a moment, her looking out at the darkening valley and him standing behind her with the warmth of the fire beginning to reach them both. "Mabel Pruitt did not say a word when we left the courtroom," he said. "No," Wren said. "First time in living memory." She turned around. He was closer than she expected. Not imposing, just present. His face in the firelight had the quality it had taken on over the past weeks, the quality of a man who had stopped managing his expression so rigorously because he had stopped needing to. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them the fire spoke, and the kettle began its low preliminary sound before the boil. "Sit down," she said. "Your knee has been standing too long today." He sat. She made the coffee. She set his cup at the edge of the stove where it would stay warm and brought her own to the table and sat across from him, and the embroidered cloth was between them as it had been every evening since the first night, its yellow daisies soft in the firelight. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She watched his face. He was looking at the cloth, not the way he had looked at it the first night, with that controlled tightening along the jaw, the expression of a man catching himself off guard. He was looking at it the way he had been looking at it for weeks now, with the ease of familiarity, with the particular quality of regard that a person gives to something that has become part of the landscape of their ordinary days. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat where it hung on the left peg. She heard the sound of it, the soft sound of something small being taken from a pocket that had held it for some time. He brought two things to the table and set them down between them, beside the embroidered cloth, in the lamplight. The first was a small wooden bird, carved from a piece of pale, close-grained wood she recognized as the white oak from the barn, the same wood he had used for the cane. The bird was perhaps 3 inches long, wings slightly lifted as though it had just made the decision to fly and had not yet committed to the air. The carving was fine, the feathers suggested with small precise cuts that caught the light at different angles and made the whole thing seem to shift slightly when she moved. The second was her letter, the one she had written 8 months ago at a table in Cincinnati with nothing left to lose, and sent north to a stranger in Montana who had posted 3 lines in a newspaper and waited to see who would answer. Folded soft at the creases, worn from being carried, she looked at both of them. "I have read it many times," he said. "More than I intended to." He looked at the letter, then at her. "You wrote that you were not looking for romance, that you were looking for purpose." He paused. "I think you found it. I think you made it, which is not the same thing and is considerably harder." She looked at the letter lying beside the carved bird in the lamplight, the two objects that contained between them the whole of the distance they had traveled. "I was wrong about one thing," she said quietly. He waited. "I said I believed we understood each other." She looked up at him. "I did not understand you at all. Not then. What I understand now is different from what I thought I was looking for. What is it? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Home, she said. I think I was looking for home and did not know what to call it. The fire spoke in the stove. I do not have a ring, he said. His voice was even, the way it was always even when he was saying something that cost him. The last one I had, I buried with Miriam. I would not give it to you anyway. It was hers. It should stay with her. He looked at the bird. I am not asking you to be what she was. I am not asking you to fill something that her absence left. I am asking something different than that. He raised his eyes to hers. I am asking you to stay, he said. Not because I need someone to keep the fire and manage the accounts and stand between me and men like Cresswell. Though you have done all of those things and done them better than I had any right to expect. He stopped. Something moved in his face, honest and unguarded, and entirely without the management she had first known in him. I am asking because this cabin is different with you in it. I am different with you in it. And I do not want to go back to what I was before. The kettle sang on the back of the stove. Wren looked at the bird. She looked at his hands around the coffee cup, the rough, familiar hands she had held in the dark of a January morning when neither of them spoke and neither of them needed to. She looked at his face. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with one battered valise that weighed almost nothing. The woman who had learned to make herself small enough that no one would think her presence worth the trouble of removing. The woman who had answered a stranger's advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper, not because she believed in second chances, but because she had run out of first ones. She thought about what had happened to that woman in the 4 months since. She had broken ice in a frozen trough at 5 a.m. in temperatures that cracked the wood of the barn door. She had dragged a man twice her size through snow for 2 hours because leaving him was not something she was capable of considering. She had stood in front of Harlan Cresswell in a Montana yard and told him her husband would stand when he was ready, and she had meant every syllable of it. She had felt for 4 months like a person who existed. She reached out and picked up the carved bird. It was warm from the pocket where he had carried it for a month. The wood was smooth under her fingers, the carving precise and detailed, the wings lifted at that angle of imminent flight. I have been staying, she said quietly, since the first night I kept the coffee warm. Something in him released, not dramatically, not the way things released in stories, with visible weightlifting and faces transformed. Just a long, slow exhalation, the kind that comes from somewhere a person has been holding for a very long time, and the gradual settling of his shoulders into a shape she had not seen on him before. The shape of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying so long, he forgot it was a choice to carry it. He reached across the table. He placed his hand over hers, the hand that held the bird, and left it there. She turned her hand over beneath his and held on. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its dark and its vast, indifferent silence. The pines on the ridge moved in the night wind with their low, continuous sound like water over stone. Below in the valley, somewhere in the dark, Copper Creek held its small lights against the winter. Inside, the fire burned with the steady confidence of a fire well built and well tended. The lamp was full. The embroidered cloth lay between them on the table with its small yellow daisies that a woman had stitched on long afternoons in a kitchen in Ohio before her daughter knew enough to understand what was being preserved. They sat until the fire burned low. They did not need to fill the time with anything other than what it already was. Eventually, Wren rose and banked the stove for the night. Everett stood slowly, without the cane this time, and moved to the window and looked out at the dark valley below the ridge. She could see his reflection in the glass over his shoulder, his face quiet, his posture the posture of a man who has come to rest in himself. She set the wooden bird on the shelf above the stove, between the lamp and the coffee tin, where the morning light would find it first. She looked at it for a moment. "Good night," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at the bird on the shelf. He looked at her. "Good night, Wren," he said. She went to her room and closed the door and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain and felt, with a fullness that had nowhere to go but inward, what it meant to be in a place that had become, without announcement or ceremony, a place that was hers. In the morning, she rose before light. She built the fire the way she built it every morning, with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered, feeding the kindling carefully, setting the larger wood when the flame had established itself, adjusting the damper to the precise position that would bring the cabin to warmth by the time Everett's boots touched the floor. She ground the coffee and set the pot on. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stood at the south window and watched the dark begin to change over the valley. The sky went from black to the deep blue of earliest morning, and then the peaks above the ridge caught the first light, and the long pale gold of it spread down the mountainside toward the cabin with the slow certainty of something that did not hurry because it did not need to. She heard him on the ladder. She heard his boots on the floor. She heard him cross the room, and she heard him stop. She turned around. He was standing at the shelf above the stove, looking at the carved bird in the early morning light. The light came through the south window and touched the pale wood of it, and the lifted wings caught it at the angle of the carving and held it. He stood there a moment. Then he turned and found his cup at the edge of the stove where she had already set it, and he picked it up and came to the window beside her. They stood together and looked out at the morning coming into the valley below. The snow was still on the ground, but the light on it was different than February light, warmer with the particular quality of light that comes when the season has begun. Even imperceptibly, even weeks before anyone would call it spring, to turn. The coffee steamed between their hands. "The east trough will need breaking," he said. "I know," she said. "I will do it after breakfast." "I will come with you." She looked at him. "Your knee," she said. "Is better," he said. "And it is my trough." She looked back out at the valley. "All right," she said. The morning held them both inside its quiet, and the fire burned behind them in the cabin that had been built by a man who intended it to last, and the carved bird sat on the shelf in the new light, wings lifted, deciding. The cabin was no longer just his, and the woman who had arrived with a single valise lighter than a season's worth of anything had, at last, put something down too. The long habit of being invisible, the practiced smallness of a life lived in the margins of someone else's. She had set it down somewhere between the first frost and the last of the February snow, and she had not noticed exactly when, and she did not intend to pick it up again. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do. It waited. It held. It kept everything it had ever held, and asked nothing in return. The valley below Calloway Ridge was beginning, in the way that valleys begin things slowly and without drama, to think about spring. And on the shelf above the stove, in the new light coming through the south window of a cabin built to last, a small carved bird held its wings at the angle of a thing that had decided, finally, to fly. It was Wren who noticed the curtains first, or rather the absence of them. In the particular way you notice the absence of something once you have decided the absence is no longer necessary. She had been noticing the bare window frames for 5 months without thinking of them as something to change, because they had been bare when she arrived, and she had not arrived to change things, but to be useful. And being useful had seemed, for a long time, like a different category of activity than belonging. She understood now that they were not different categories at all, that being useful to a place and belonging to it were the same thing approached from 2 directions, and that she had been belonging to Calloway Ridge since approximately the 2nd week of October without knowing that was what she was doing. She made curtains from the blue calico she had ordered from Pruitt's store in the last supply delivery. Simple panels, unhemmed at the sides, gathered at the top with a length of cord. She put them up one morning while Everett was out checking the fence line on the north pasture. The fence line that would need replacing in another 2 years, the one he had mentioned to her as a small piece of information in passing in December, and that she had stored in her map of him alongside everything else. When he came back in the early afternoon and saw them, he stopped in the doorway the way he had stopped on the 9th day when he saw the woodpile rearranged. He looked at the curtains for a long moment. The windows needed something, she said from the stove. He was quiet. Blue, he said finally. It was what they had at Pruitt's. Another silence. She did not turn around. She heard him come further into the room. She heard him stop again near the south window, and she could tell from the quality of the light on the back of the stove that he was standing in it, looking out through the blue calico at the valley below. "It looks like something," he said. His voice had a quality in it she had not heard before, something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was some combination of the two. "Like what?" she said. He was quiet again for a long moment. "Like someone lives here," he said, "and intends to keep living here." She turned around then. He was standing at the south window with the afternoon light coming through the blue calico and falling across his face in a way that was softer than the usual hard Montana light, filtered and colored and changed by the simple fact of the cloth between the glass and the room. He was looking at the curtains, and his expression had gone past the ghost of something and had become the thing itself, open and unhurried and entirely without the management that had been the first thing she had noticed about him on the platform at Copper Creek in October. She looked at him, looking at the curtains, and she thought about the letter in her coat pocket that first afternoon, the one he had folded and refolded until the creases were soft. She thought about what it had said and what it had meant and what it had actually been, which was not a letter about purpose or practicality, but a letter from a woman who had run out of ways to be in the world she knew, and was asking, with as much dignity as she could manage, if there was room for her in a world she did not. There had been room. There was room. There was, she understood now, considerably more room than either of them had known how to ask for. And they had found it together the way you find your footing on a difficult trail, step by careful step, in weather that did not ask permission and cold, that simply arrived and stayed and eventually, without drama, became the place you lived. She turned back to the stove. The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups and carried them to the window where he was still standing. And she handed him one and stood beside him, and they both looked out through the blue calico at the valley below, at the snow that was beginning in that imperceptible, unhurried way to pull back from the lower slopes, at the sky above the peaks, which was the deep, clear blue of a Montana late winter day, when the weather has decided to be honest about what it is. The coffee was warm. The curtains moved slightly in the draft from the door gap, a small motion, back and forth, the way things move when they have found their place and are simply living in it. The carved bird on the shelf held its wings at the angle of decision. The embroidered cloth on the table held its yellow daisies the way it had held them through 5 months of mornings and evenings, patient and exact and entirely itself. Outside, somewhere below the ridge, in the returning voice of the creek, the mountain was beginning to say something about spring. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The cabin was warm. The coffee was strong. And Calloway Ridge, which had been built by a man who intended it to last, was lasting in the way it had always been intended to, holding steady against whatever the weather brought, keeping the cold at the walls and the warmth at the center, doing the quiet, necessary work of being a place where people could, if they chose to, remain.